All right, time to dive deep into Canadian history. This time, it's all about Confederation.
A pretty big moment, eh?
Definitely a turning point.
Yeah.
And you've given us a ton of material to dig through. Study guides.
FAQs, briefing documents.
Oh, and even a grade 6 textbook chapter.
We're going to cover all the bases, that's for sure. Figure out how Canada went from a bunch of separate colonies
To, well, Canada as we know it.
Exactly.
You want the full expert level breakdown.
Well, then let's get started.
Okay, so back to the mid-1800s, British North America. What was going on that eventually led these colonies to say, hey, maybe we should join forces?
You know, it's fascinating. These sources really paint a picture of just how complex things were.
I bet. I mean, it wasn't just a smooth ride towards unity.
Not at all. Imagine all of these colonies, each with their own struggles and identities, trying to figure out their place in the world. It's like a historical puzzle we're trying to solve.
Okay, so let's break down that puzzle. What were the big forces at play that pushed these colonies towards Confederation?
Well, think of it like a perfect storm brewing. 3 major factors.
Yeah.
Political deadlock, changing trade winds, and defense dilemmas.
A perfect storm, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack that. First up, political deadlock. What does that even mean?
Basically, it was a political traffic jam. The province of Canada, that's Canada East and West together, they were constantly battling for power.
Ah, so already some tension there. Makes sense.
Oh, yeah. One of the biggest fights was over representation, how many elected officials each region would get.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. Canada West, their population was booming. They were pushing for rep by pop, representation by population. Seems fair on the surface.
Yeah, you'd think.
But Canada East, they were worried about getting steamrolled by the larger population out west.
Makes sense. So that's one layer of this deadlock. Were there any other factors adding to the tension?
Definitely. Language politics. There was this unspoken rule that everyone in the assembly had to speak English, but some politicians, like Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine, he would purposely speak French to assert his identity, challenge the status quo.
Whoa, that's making a statement. I can only imagine the atmosphere in those rooms.
It was intense, but those internal struggles weren't the only problem. Remember, there were external factors too, those shifting trade winds you mentioned.
Right. Things were changing on a global scale too, weren't they?
Exactly. The old system, where the colonies basically just traded with Britain, that was falling apart. Britain was moving toward free trade. Colonies had to adapt.
Big changes.
Huge. And then on top of that, their trade agreement with the U.S. gets canceled in 1864. Talk about bad timing. All of a sudden, these colonies are facing massive economic uncertainty.
Yikes. Yeah, going it alone doesn't sound too appealing in that situation.
Not at all. And then, to make matters even worse, we have factor number 3, defense dilemmas.
Things must feel pretty unstable with the American Civil War raging just next door.
Right. That war really amplified those anxieties about American expansionism. And it wasn't just paranoia. You had events like the Fenian raids. These Irish-American groups launching actual attacks on British North America really highlighted the colony's vulnerability.
Wow, it's starting to feel like these colonies were being squeezed from every direction. But even with all that pressure, I'm guessing the decision to unite wasn't exactly a unanimous yes?
Absolutely not. It sparked a huge debate. Strong arguments on both sides of the issue.
Okay, let's delve into those arguments. What were the main points made by the pro-Confederation side? What were they promising?
Well, they basically framed it as the path to a brighter future. Stronger together, that sort of thing.
Right.
More stability, more prosperity, more security.
Makes sense. Unity usually has that appeal.
Right. And one of their big arguments was that it would solve those internal political deadlocks, like that whole representation issue we talked about. And they also argued that a unified government would be more efficient and effective overall.
Like pooling resources on a national level?
Exactly. And then there was the economic argument. Pro-Confederation folks, they envisioned this booming intercolonial trade network, access to new markets, massive projects like an intercolonial railway to connect everything. They said, unite and the economy will flourish.
So political stability, economic growth, and I'm guessing defense was a big part of their argument too.
Oh, absolutely. They hammered home that point. Look, they said, a united Canada will be much stronger. We can defend ourselves, especially against those Americans down south. They pointed to the Civil War, that whole manifest destiny idea. They used it as evidence that the colonies needed to band together for safety.
Okay, so it was all connected. Politics, economics, defense, not just one single issue. But what about the other side of the coin? What were the concerns of those who opposed Confederation?
Well, for many, especially in those smaller colonies, the biggest fear was losing their autonomy. They were used to governing themselves, making their own decisions. They didn't want to be told what to do by some distant central authority.
Yeah, it's a classic David versus Goliath situation, isn't it?
Totally. And they were also worried about their economies. Some colonies were doing quite well on their own. They feared that Confederation would force them to trade primarily with other Canadian provinces, potentially hurting their existing relationships with Britain and the U.S.
We're doing all right, they're saying. Why rock the boat?
Precisely. Plus, there were cultural anxieties mixed in with those economic worries. French Canadians, particularly, they worried about preserving their language, their culture, their institutions within a larger, mostly English-speaking union. That fear of being marginalized, losing their unique identity.
It's important to remember, isn't it? This wasn't just about politics and economics. It was about people, their identities, their anxieties about the future.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the Maritime colonies had a particularly interesting take on Confederation. What made their situation unique?
Well, you have to understand what was going on in the Maritimes back then. They were in what historians call their golden age. They were thriving. Their economy was booming. Shipbuilding, international trade, that was their thing. Their ships, world-renowned, top-notch quality and craftsmanship.
So they were already killing it. Why even consider joining this new dominion?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? It's like they were standing at a crossroads. On one hand, they had this amazing track record, but on the other, they were starting to face some serious challenges. New technologies, like those steam-powered ships, they were coming up, threatening their shipbuilding dominance.
Is that dilemma stick with the familiar, even if it might be fading, or take a chance on something new and unknown? Tough call.
Really tough. It was a gamble either way. Join the new dominion. Risk losing their autonomy, disrupting their successful economy, stay independent, maybe face an uncertain future as the world changes around them. The maritime question was a tricky one.
Wow, this is already making my head spin. So much to think about.
Mm.
But before we go any further, let's shift gears and talk about the actual process of Confederation. How did they actually manage to hammer out an agreement with all these competing interests and worries? What compromises were made? What big decisions shaped this brand new Canada?
Well, it definitely wasn't easy creating a new nation. It wasn't just drawing lines on a map. They had to build a whole new system of government.
Right. It's like building a house. You need a solid foundation, a clear plan. So how did they approach that? What decisions really shaped this brand new Canada?
Well, one of the biggest decisions and a huge compromise was adopting federalism. That was a delicate balancing act, I'll tell you. They needed to give the central government enough power to ensure stability and unity, like a backbone for the whole country. But they also had to allow the provinces to keep control over their own local affairs.
I can see how that would be tricky. Too much power at the center, the smaller provinces feel like they're losing their voice. But too much power in the provinces and the whole thing could fall apart.
Exactly. They had to find that sweet spot, that balance of power. The British North America Act, which is basically Canada's first constitution, laid out the framework. The federal government got control over national stuff. Defense, trade, currency, criminal law, the big picture stuff.
Makes sense. We've already talked about those anxieties around defense and trade, so it seems logical for those to be federal responsibilities.
Yeah.
What about the stuff considered more local or regional? What were the provinces in charge of?
They got to handle things like education, healthcare, natural resources, property rights, local infrastructure, the stuff closer to home.
National for some things, local for others. That division of powers, even though it's evolved over time, it's still fundamental to how Canada operates today, isn't it?
It is. And it contributes to Canada's diversity. Different provinces can have different approaches to things like education and healthcare based on their specific needs and what their people want. But of course, federalism, it's not a perfect system. Dividing up the power like that, it can lead to disagreements and tension between the federal and provincial governments.
I bet. Who gets to decide what? Who's paying for this? I can already imagine the arguments.
Oh, there were plenty of those, for sure. But hold on. The government shakeup wasn't done yet. They also created a brand new parliament.
A whole new parliament. Wow, they weren't messing around.
Nope. And it wasn't just any parliament. It was a bicameral parliament, meaning two houses, the House of Commons and the Senate.
Two houses. Why not just stick with one? Keep it simple.
Well, remember that whole representation issue? They needed a system that would appease both the big and small provinces, so the House of Commons, that was designed to be based on representation by population. Finally, Rep by pop. The more people you have in a province, the more elected representatives you get.
Makes sense for those larger provinces. But what about the smaller ones? How do they make sure those voices weren't drowned out?
That's where the Senate comes in. It was designed to give every region, no matter how many people, they had equal representation.
Ah, so it's a balancing act. House of Commons representing the people, and the Senate making sure every region has an equal say. But there's a twist, right? How were the senators chosen? It wasn't through elections, was it?
Nope, not elections. Senators were and still are appointed.
Appointed. Wait, so they're not directly chosen by the people? Why go that route?
Well, the thinking was that an appointed Senate would provide stability, expertise. They could take a longer-term view compared to those elected officials always focused on winning the next election.
Like a council of wise elders, offering their guidance and perspective.
Something like that.
So who actually did the appointing?
The Governor General, the Queen's representative.
Ah, so the power ultimately rested with the crown. Big responsibility. But, okay, let's get back to the big picture. Did this bicameral system with the House of Commons and the Senate actually solve that political deadlock that was plaguing the province of Canada?
Well, it definitely helped. It tackled that whole representation issue head on. Canada West got their rep by pop in the House of Commons, and Canada East got the reassurance that they wouldn't be completely dominated because they had equal representation in the Senate. But of course, a bicameral system doesn't magically erase all disagreements.
Politics is never that simple. But it sounds like it at least created a framework for dealing with those disagreements in a more balanced way. So we've got this new federal system, a shiny new parliament. What else was on the to-do list for the Fathers of Confederation?
Well, they couldn't call it a country without a capital now, could they?
That's true. Did they just pick one of those big, obvious cities? I can just imagine a battle royale between Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City for the title.
Well, you're not far off. Those big cities were definitely in the running. But picking a capital wasn't that simple. None of them could agree. It caused, you guessed it, more deadlock.
Oh no, not another deadlock. So what do? Flip a coin.
Huh. They actually took a pretty unique approach. They asked Queen Victoria to choose. Seriously. They just handed the decision over to the Queen. That's passing the buck on a whole new level. So who did Queen Victoria choose?
A small logging town called Bytown, which was later renamed Ottawa.
Ottawa, that's a surprise. It wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis back then, was it?
Not exactly. But there were some strategic reasons for that choice. First off, Ottawa was right on the border between Canada East and West. So it was a nice compromise between those two rivals.
Ah, so geographically a good middle ground.
Exactly. And it sat where three rivers met, so access by water, which was super important back then, was easy. But maybe the biggest reason, given all those anxieties we've talked about, was defense.
I see where you're going with this. Being further inland, Ottawa was less vulnerable to attack, especially from those Americans down south that everyone was so worried about.
You got it. Choosing Ottawa was a way to minimize the risk. Especially with all the tension with the U.S. at that time, it was seen as a safer choice.
Interesting. A decision made out of caution that led to Ottawa becoming the capital of this huge, diverse country. Yep, history's full of unexpected turns. But speaking of unexpected turns, we've been talking about this whole nation-building project, this new government, but we haven't really touched on who was actually included and who was excluded in the whole process.
That's a good point. We keep mentioning representation and compromise, but those words only really mean something if everyone actually has a seat at the table.
Exactly. And the truth is, the Confederation we're discussing, it wasn't exactly a model of inclusivity. In fact, most people living in Canada at the time, they had absolutely no say in the matter.
Wow. That's a far cry from how we think about democracy today. Who exactly was being left out of the conversation?
Well, for starters, women. No voting rights whatsoever. It would be decades before women across Canada would win that basic right.
So it wasn't a true government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Not even close. And it wasn't just women. Various minority groups were also shut out of the political process.
Wow. And wasn't there another even bigger omission? You mentioned earlier that First Nations were totally excluded from the Confederation discussions.
That's right. And honestly, that exclusion is one of the most glaring flaws of Confederation. Remember, this was a time when relations between the colonial government and Indigenous peoples were already strained. Treaties were broken, land was taken, Indigenous ways of life disrupted.
So basically, the very people whose land this new nation was being built on were completely ignored. That's a harsh reality check.
It is, and the impact of that exclusion is still felt in Canada today. The ongoing process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, that's proof of that. But before we get too focused on the shortcomings, let's step back and look at what Confederation did achieve. Despite its flaws, it did lay the foundation for the Canada we know today. What would you say were some of its most important, long-lasting impacts?
That's a good point. It's important to acknowledge the negative, but also recognize how Confederation shaped this nation. So what were the big wins, so to speak? What lasting changes did it set in motion? Well, one of the most obvious is westward expansion. Creating this new dominion, it opened the door for more provinces and territories to join. That's what eventually led to this huge, diverse country we know today.
Absolutely. Confederation really paved the way for Canada to become coast to coast to coast. Gave them a structure to incorporate new territories to keep expanding westward. It was massive for the country's development.
But it wasn't just about expanding geographically, right? Confederation also led to all those national institutions that kind of tied the country together.
Right. Think about it. A single currency. No more juggling all those different colonial currencies. And a national postal service. Plus, and this is a big one, that intercolonial railway they were always talking about. These are massive projects that help to physically and symbolically link the country from east to west.
It's like they were building the physical and the symbolic framework of a nation at the same time. And those shared institutions, I bet they played a big role in creating a sense of national identity.
They definitely did. Of course, building a national identity is complicated, doesn't happen overnight. But Confederation was a turning point. People started to see themselves not just as Nova Scotians or Ontarians, but as Canadians. And that shared identity, that was essential for building a sense of unity, a shared purpose.
Makes you wonder, what if those colonies hadn't united? Would they have achieved the same kind of growth and stability on their own? Food for thought.
Definitely. And speaking of things to ponder, we've talked about the practical impact of Confederation, the expansion, the institutions, the identity, but it also established some core governing principles, the ones that still shape Canadian politics to this day.
Right. Those debates and compromises, they weren't just about solving problems right then and there. They were about setting the course for the future. So what were some of the big lasting principles that came out of Confederation?
Well, we've already talked about federalism, haven't we? That balancing act between keeping the nation unified while giving provinces some autonomy, that's still a cornerstone of Canadian politics today, something that's constantly being negotiated and renegotiated.
Like a never-ending dance between the feds and the provinces, figuring out who gets to make the calls on what.
That's it. Another key principle is responsible government. The idea that the government is accountable to the people through their elected representatives. The government has to answer to the people, not just the crown.
Keeping those in power in check. I can see how that idea of accountability shaped Canadian democracy over time.
Absolutely. And then there's regional representation, the principle that all regions, no matter how many people they have a voice in the national conversation. The way they've done it has definitely changed. Think about that appointed Senate. But the principle itself is still there.
It's amazing. Those core principles, the ones they fought over back in the 1860s, they're still relevant today. Talk about a lasting impact. It's like their decisions created these ripples that are still being felt.
Yeah.
But, as we talk about all these achievements, I keep thinking back to those who were excluded from the Confederation process. Women, minority groups, especially the First Nations. It reminds us that Confederation, for all the progress it brought, also left behind a legacy of inequality, of injustice.
You're right. It's something we have to acknowledge. Excluding those voices had a huge impact on Canada, and those wounds are still there. The reconciliation efforts going on today with Indigenous peoples, they show just how deep those wounds run.
Yeah. It reminds us that Confederation, while a big moment in Canadian history, wasn't some magical solution. It actually created new challenges, made old ones even worse. Like they opened one door but found another one that was locked shut.
I like that analogy. Confederation was a beginning, not the end. It started a new chapter, but brought new complexities, new contradictions. And now it's up to every generation after to face those complexities and try to build a fairer, more just society.
It's like you're passing the torch to our listeners,
Yeah.
challenging them to continue the work the Fathers of Confederation started. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway? What do we want our listeners to really remember about Confederation?
The big thing to remember is that Confederation was a product of its time, a messy, imperfect process. It wasn't a fairy tale or a mission accomplished kind of moment. But it did set the stage for the Canada we have today, the good and the bad. And understanding that history, both the bright spots and the dark ones, that's crucial for dealing with the challenges we face as a nation today.
I like that. It's not just about celebrating the victories, but understanding the missteps, learning from the mistakes, using that knowledge to guide us as we move forward. So listeners, we encourage you to keep digging into this time in Canadian history. Look up the biographies of those key players. Find out how voting rights evolved. Learn more about the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. There's so much more to uncover, so many lessons waiting to be learned.
That's right. Keep those curious minds working, folks. Remember, the past isn't just a bunch of old stories. It's a living force that shapes us today and in the future.
That's a great way to put it. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Confederation. Until next time, keep diving deep. Well, one of the most obvious is westward expansion. Creating this new dominion, it really opened the door for more provinces and territories to join. It's what led to this massive, diverse country we know today.
That's right. It really did set the stage for Canada stretching from sea to sea to sea. Provided that framework, right, to incorporate new territories, to keep expanding westward, really had huge implications for how the country developed.
But it wasn't just about, just growing geographically. Confederation also led to all those national institutions that kind of helped tie the country together, right?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. A single currency, no more messing around with all those different colonial currencies, and a national postal service. Oh, and that intercolonial railway that everyone was always talking about. Huge, massive projects that really helped connect the country, from east to west, both, physically and symbolically.
Yeah. It's like they were building the infrastructure for a nation. Literally and figuratively at the same time.
Yeah.
And I bet those shared institutions, did a lot to create a sense of national identity.
Oh, for sure. Of course, creating a shared identity, that's a complicated process, right? It's not like it happens overnight or anything. But Confederation, it was a turning point.
Yeah.
People started to see themselves, not just as Nova Scotians or Ontarians, but as Canadians. And that shared identity was so important for building a sense of unity, having that shared purpose.
It really makes you think, what if they hadn't united those colonies? I mean, would they have been able to achieve the same kind of growth, the same kind of stability, on their own? Interesting to consider.
It is. And, speaking of things to think about, we've talked about the practical impacts of Confederation, expansion, institutions, that shared identity, but Confederation, it also established some core governing principles, right? The ones that are still shaping Canadian politics today.
Right. All those debates, all those compromises they made, they weren't just about solving problems in the moment, They were about setting the course for the future. So what were some of those big, enduring principles that kind of came out of Confederation?
Well, we've already talked about federalism quite a bit, haven't we? That whole balancing act between national unity and giving provinces some autonomy. That's still a cornerstone of Canadian politics today. Always being negotiated, renegotiated.
Yeah, it's like this ongoing dance, right, between the federal government and the provinces.
Yeah.
Always trying to figure out who gets to make the decisions about what.
Exactly. Another key principle is, responsible government. The idea that the government has to be accountable to the people through, their elected representatives. It's that basic idea that the government answers to the people, not just to the crown.
Keeps those in power in check. It makes sense that whole idea of accountability, played a big role in how Canadian democracy developed, over time.
For sure. And then there's regional representation, making sure all regions, no matter how many people they have, get to have a say in those big national conversations. And sure, the way they do it has changed. Think about that appointed Senate we talked about. But the principle itself, still super important.
It's amazing to think those core principles, the ones they were battling over back in the 1860s, they're still so relevant today. Shows you the real impact of Confederation,
Yeah.
Their decisions had these ripple effects that are still felt today. But, I can't help but think back to those who were excluded from that whole process. Women, minority groups, and especially, the First Nations. It's a reminder that Confederation, for all the progress it brought, also left a legacy of inequality and injustice behind.
Absolutely. We can't ignore that. And it's something we can't shy away from. The fact that those voices were excluded, it had a huge impact on how Canada developed, and you can still feel those historical wounds today. The work that's being done on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, it's a testament to that.
Yeah. It reminds us that Confederation, even though it was this huge moment, wasn't a magical solution. It created new challenges. It actually made some existing problems even worse, kind of like opening a door only to find another door that's locked shut.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Confederation was a beginning, not an ending. It kicked off this new era, but it brought with it new complexities, new contradictions, and ultimately it's up to each generation to face those complexities head on and work towards creating a more just, a more equitable society.
That's a powerful thought. It's like you're passing the torch to all our listeners,
Yeah.
challenging them to pick up where the Fathers of Confederation left off.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway? What's the one thing we really want our listeners to remember about Confederation?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Confederation. It was a product of its time. Complex, imperfect, shaped by all these different forces, all these different perspectives. And look, it wasn't a fairy tale. And it wasn't a mission accomplished moment either. But it did lay the foundation for the Canada we have today, with all the good and all the, the not so good. And understanding that history, the triumphs, the struggles, the whole thing, it's crucial for, dealing with the challenges we face today.
I like that. It's not just about, patting ourselves on the back for the good stuff, right?
No.
It's about recognizing those shortcomings, learning from those mistakes that were made, and using that knowledge to, shape how we move forward as a nation.
Exactly.
So, listeners, we encourage you to keep digging into this period in Canadian history. Read some biographies of the big players. See how voting rights changed. Learn more about what reconciliation with Indigenous peoples looks like. There's still so much to discover.
Keep those curious minds working.
Right. And remember, the past. It's not just a bunch of dusty old stories. It shapes who we are, both now and in the future. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into Confederation. Until next time, folks, keep diving deep.